many of you have come from far away. For example, Roman Beat from Glasgow and Julia DeLeo. Well, we don't actually have any idea where Julia DeLeo is. And some have come from very remote places like upstate New York, Steve Eleanor. And yeah, thank you all for coming. Some of you have come from very near, actually, from here at Emory, and so thank you for coming across Clifton. And it's really kind of a testament as to kind of how much we value Les as both a colleague and as a friend. And it's been kind of remarkable while we've been organizing this event, just how many people have kind of contacted us and said, either sending their regrets saying they couldn't come, but here's a story, you know, and I had this best time with Les, and we had these great conversations and so forth. And for those of you who are here, I've also heard from a bunch of you about kind of some of these really funny stories, and also just really exciting kind of intellectual conversations and journeys. And so we will hear a bunch of those this morning from various aspects of kind of Les's career stages. So we are really looking forward to those. In the afternoon, what we have planned are panel discussions and a set of debates. That really stems from Les repeatedly kind of reminiscing about his times at Michigan and how you know, the culture at that time was one kind of very much of debates and just brutal debates. And so we are hoping to have a lot of fun this afternoon, and we want to have a lot of audience participation, and you know, we can try to relive the Michigan days to close his career. Yeah, so thank you all for coming. We're going to really kick off the event with John Lucchesi giving a few words of welcome. John was the chair here in the Department of Biology at Emory when Les was hired. Yeah, thank you all for coming.
It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. The age of wisdom, the age of foolishness. No, but seriously. The graduate division of biological and biomedical sciences was established in 1990, and it was made up exclusively of programs that were that were under the rubric of the medical school, the biomedical programs. And so the biology department sought the advice of an external committee, had Wyatt Anderson from the University of Georgia, had Bruce Levin, who at the time was at Amherst, had Yanis Antonovic, who at the time was at Duke. And following their advice, we decided to be the hub of a new program in the division that would emphasize, oh my God, excuse me. It's a telecommunication. That would emphasize the fundamental subjects of population biology, ecology, and evolution. There were two ecologists at the time in the department, and the linchpin of population biology and evolutionary biology was Bruce Levin, who came from Amherst. After some time, it was clear that the program needed some additional strength in ecology and in evolutionary biology, and the consensus was that someone with Les Real's expertise would be highly desirable. So I had overlapped with Les, as some of you know, at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, and I had been fascinated by his experimental approach rather than purely descriptive approach to ecology. He had since then moved to Indiana, so I picked up the phone and I said, "Hi Les, are you movable?" He says, "John, everybody's movable." He had become interested in the ecology of infectious diseases, and so the possibility of direct interactions with the CDC, with our School of Medicine, with our School of Public Health, were very attractive to him. Soon after his arrival at Emory, he succeeded Bruce Levin as director of the PBEE program, and he developed this program that we had initiated as a new program in the division into an elite, trend-setting, national graduate program that is this until today. When we got Les, we not only got a world-class scientist, but we also got the Smithsonian prototype of a modern Renaissance man. So I was the speaker at this celebration, and Les himself are going to talk about his science and his accomplishments. I will just give you a very brief glimpse of Les, the Renaissance man. So, let's start with a slide. So, as you know, Les has an encyclopedic knowledge of the history of sciences, the history of mathematics. He has an encyclopedic knowledge and understanding of philosophy, of religion, of art, of music, and he matches this amazing intellectual versatility with some spectacular artistic accomplishments. For example, oh, that's the wrong computer. For example, as most of you at Emory know, he's a photographer. There he is, taking photographs. And he has published this collection of his works several years ago. Pictures that he took of the Arizona Plateau, the ecology of the Arizona Plateau. He's an experienced woodworker. This is a credenza that he has built. And he's a potter. Some of the pots on these shelves are his own pots. He is a shipbuilder. This is a canoe that he finished recently. That, by the way, as you know, is his son Daniel. The other Dr. Real in the audience. And most amazingly, he has built this sailboat that you can see on the full sail here from scratch, not from a kit. He built it from scratch. Clearly, he intends to continue this type of activity because this is the workshop that he has set up in his place in Star Creek. And he has already started to use this workshop to build guitars. Speaking of music, you heard him last night. He's an accomplished organetto player. He also plays the concertina and the guitar. He's an expert and a collector of Southwest Indian art with special emphasis on pottery. I could go on, but I only have 5 minutes, which I have already exceeded. All I can say is that speaking of collections, Les himself is a collectible. And his friendship has been and still is one of my precious possessions.
Well, I heard a talk once. Herbert Baker was being introduced, and he was introduced like that, and he got up and said, I could listen to introduction like that forever. and for a minute I thought I was going to. I mean, it's amazing I'm so happy that everybody's here. It's a real treat. And I've been at this for so long. I've been doing this for close to 50 years, and I have 30 minutes, so I'm going to get started. And talk about my favorite goodwill wish was from Jim and Astrid Brown. Jim and I edited, the Foundations of Ecology together. I've known them for years. And Astrid wrote to me, and she said, good luck on your retirement. You're going to really enjoy it. Jim and I retired, and we've never had more time. We're going to miss your retirement. You're going to enjoy it. You'll never have more time, and you'll only do the things that you enjoy. Which is why they're not here, I guess. In any case, so it's kind of a custom to give these swan songs. We give this long litany of your research, and then there's a picture of a sunset. And so, I'm not going to do that. My career, my scientific career has been quite varied. I did different things at different times. And rather than focus on the research per se, I really want to focus on the role of luck in my career and how lucky I've been, and the ways in which luck has just entered into my career and my life, and how important luck is. And I'm going to start with a story by Pete Seeger. Those under 30 probably don't know Pete Seeger. But he was a really, really famous folk singer in the 1960s. He was large, among others, responsible for the folk music revival, and he was an important anti-Vietnam War protester. But he told this great story about two slugs. Two little slugs are on a branch, and a strong wind comes and knocks the two slugs off of the branch, and one little slug lands on the cement and another slug lands in the grass. And the one on the cement, it's got nothing to eat, no water, it's drying up and shriveling and can barely make it, and this other slug is in the grass and it's got lots of water, and they finally they meet each other at the interface between the cement and the grass, and the slug that's been on the cement says, my goodness, look at me, I'm all shriveled up and got nothing, and look at you all fat and greasy, and how'd you get that way? And the fat slug said, brains and personality. It's a story I like to tell academics a lot. But I've been really lucky. I mean, my first piece of luck was just going to the schools that I went to when I went to them. I got my BA at Indiana University at a great time in Michigan, Miami, NC State. Had a wonderful time at NC State, wonderful students. Several of them are here, and I'm really fortunate to have known. And then UNC Chapel Hill, where I got to know John. We wouldn't have crossed paths without that, and I wouldn't have gotten that wonderful phone call. And then I went back to Indiana. Going back to Indiana was an important transition time between when I moved from working on behavior into disease ecology, and then coming here to Emory. Coming here to Emory was a great divide and wonderful success coming here. I'm so happy that I came here. My period at Michigan, just luck plays an important part in this, and I got to know Giannis at Michigan. Michigan was a great place at that time. And it was typified. It's typified by the fact that, so I took a field course, a quantitative field ecology course, and we would go out to the George Reserve and spend weekends out there. And we would live in this little cabin, we would do field research and talk about the important ideas in ecology and evolution. And that course was taught by John Vandermeer, Steve Hubble, and Dan Jansen, who are giants in the field. And we would get occasional visits by people like Henry Wilbur, who was living out there, Nelson Harston Sr. It was an incredible period, and we spent the whole weekend debating, and they got fierce. Those debates really did get, they had a reputation of kind of being brutal. But they really weren't. They were good-natured, fierce, but good-natured. And at least the Michigan idea was that ideas are gold, and that if it's a good golden idea, then it shines the brightest when it's under fire. And so that was kind of like what we did. We tried to produce gold. And these guys really influenced me. Driving back from the coast with David Civitello, I told him about this course, and he said, well, that's just not fair. To have that kind of look. And that's where at Michigan is where I first met Giannis. I mean, there are some people here that I've known before I've gotten married. Giannis is one of them. And Giannis came as a young assistant professor. I was a graduate student in Michigan, and we became friends right from then on. So I did want to talk a little bit about the idea of what justifies a career, rather than just talk about my research. This is a picture of the elder J.B.S. Haldane. And J.B.S. Haldane, for those of you who don't know, was one of the three founders of the modern evolutionary biology. Fisher, Haldane, and Wright get a lot of credit. And Dobrowski and Meyer are from a different school. And Meyer had written this critique of Haldane, Fisher, and Wright, and said that they really didn't contribute anything to evolutionary biology because genetics was just too complicated. And so Haldane, late in his life, wrote this paper called In Defense of Beanbag Genetics, which Meyer had characterized their approach as being beanbag genetics, and Haldane wanted to defend their approach. Interestingly enough, he was supposed to give this as an address to the New York Academy of Sciences, and the United States wouldn't let him into the country because he was a devout communist, so at the time they wouldn't let him enter. So he wrote the address up, and it's been published, and I know that Bruce Levin has all of his students read In Defense of Beanbag Genetics. But what's nice about that paper is he starts off by saying, well, Fisher's dead, Wright's too nice a guy to defend our approach, so it's up to me. And he said, I've written 400 papers. I don't know what the exact number, 400 some odd papers. He says, and of those 400 papers, maybe 15 were original. And he said, and of those 15, maybe 4 or 5 were really important. And he said, that in itself justifies a career. So rather than review my 400 papers, I'm just going to talk about a couple of ideas which at least pleased me that I was lucky to have this. And I want to talk about the role of luck in coming up with some of those ideas. When I went to Indiana in the late 60s, the Vietnam War was raging, but there were all stuff in ecology and evolution was also raging. Remember, at that time, the theory of island biography was just published. Robert Payne's paper on trophic webs was only like 2 or 3 years old. The concept of keystone species was still new and being argued about. So it was a very productive, wonderful, wonderful time. And at the time, there was an interest in seeing the way in which economics and ecology and evolution could interface. That there were certain analogies between the way economic systems work and the way ecological systems work. Robert MacArthur and Eric Pianka had just written their paper on the optimal use of Apache environment, which was one of the first uses of optimization theory in ecology. Like I said, the theory of island biogeography had just been published, and everybody recognized right off that MacArthur and Wilson got their ideas by looking at supply and demand curves. And MacArthur was upfront about that. He said, yeah, I mean, we used microeconomic theory to structure the theory of island biogeography. So I got interested in that. There was a lot of interest. How can we exploit this? I got interested, and then I befriended and was befriended by a very distinguished economist, H. Scott Gordon, who was at Indiana. He's responsible for producing the fundamental theorem of resource economics and solving the common property resource problem. A very distinguished economist. And he kind of took me under his wing, and we would have long lunches together, and he would kind of point me in the right direction. And one day after a lunch, we were walking back to his office, and he stopped off at his mailroom, picked up a recent copy of the American Economic Review, looked at the table of contents, and pointed to an article and turned to me and said, "Uncertainty, that's a big problem. You should look into that." So I said, "Okay." Now that's luck, you see. That's sure, you know, if that hadn't been there, and if you hadn't pointed that article, then like the first 20 years of my career would not have been shaped the way it was. And I did these very simple experiments at Mountain Lake. Bernie Roach is in the audience, and she was involved in some of these things early on at Mountain Lake. And for the graduate students, this is an interesting thing. This cost like $48, this experiment. I went to Ace Hardware and got a big sheet of plexiglass, drilled wells in it, made up little cardboard artificial flowers, yellow and blue flowers, intermixed them randomly, 100 blue, 100 yellow, and I put, you know, 2 microliters of nectar in every blue flower, and no nectar in 2/3 of the yellow flowers, and 6 microliters of nectar in a third of the yellow flowers, so they have the same expectation, blue and yellow. But one was an uncertain resource, and the other one was this absolutely guaranteed certain resource. And if you look at the bees foraging, you let individual bumblebees out, they prefer the constant resource over the variable resource. It was a very simple experiment. And Henry Wilbur said, "This is an experiment that made your career." And it was, in some ways. It's a very simple experiment, cost $48. John was impressed with it enough to... And it's a simple experiment, and I published a paper. It gave rise to a whole industry on risk sensitivity, and we have a behavioral ecologist who teaches it. Went back to my old slides, uses it in her lecture, and this idea of things being sensitive to the variability in their environment and making behavioral decisions as a consequence of that kind of took off. And I was very lucky. It was not just me. Simultaneously, Tom Carrico at the University of Arizona came up with the exact same idea, did almost the same exact experiment, only with sparrows. And we published our papers at the same time. And then Tom and I are great friends. We published papers together, and this kind of blossomed. There's more to this than that simple experiment. There's a mathematical theory that accounts for why these animals may behave sensitive to that variability. I did some other experiments that showed that, just like stocks, if you have, you know, a certain reward and if the variable one has a higher expected gain, then actually you could prefer the variable one because the expectation has compensated for that uncertainty. And there's a mathematical structure that can describe that. That mathematical structure was actually developed by Harry Markowitz and James Tobin. Tobin at the university, at Yale University, and Markowitz at the Rand Corporation. Both of those guys won the Nobel Prize in economics for this structure. And we showed that the bees behaved according to the Markowitz-Tobin model of portfolio selection. This kind of led to an article in Science where they illustrated it with the bumblebee flying around in a 3-piece suit with an attaché case. We tried to apply this idea of risk sensitivity to many different things. And given a behavior, you can either go down and try and understand that behavior, or go up and looking at the consequences of what that behavior is. Johannes and I, along with Liz Lacey and Steve Eldner and I, we tried to, and Hal Caswell, we wrote several papers trying to extend the idea of risk sensitivity to life history evolution. We tried to extend the bumblebee behavior things into looking at the way communities of plants are organized. I did work with Beverly Rathke, Libby Marshall, who's here, and we worked together on that up at Mountain Lake. I worked with Nick Losser. And then we went down. I'll come to these guys. We went down too. And it's very interesting, you know, Gibbs, the father of statistical mechanics and Gibbs free energy, the physicist, he said that with any phenomenon you should look at the effects of that phenomenon and then the causes of that phenomenon. And in science we particularly are good at looking at the causes. We keep driving things down to causation rather than going up. So one's the arrow of reduction, the other is the arrow of holism, which is a continuous debate on whether we should be, how we balance those two, going up and going down. And it became clear very early on in behavioral ecology, and especially with the B word, that going down was going to be way easier than going up. Way easier. I mean, it's way easier. So behavioral dynamics got embraced by psychology and neurobiology, and my work was being driven further and further and further into trying to understand learning mechanisms. And I eventually was collaborating with someone at Ohio State University where we were with Brian Smith and Sharoni Shafir. And we were working with little tethered bees where we were looking at neural traces and trying to figure out what the neural circuits were associated with how bees actually learned, what the probability distributions were, and whether you could substitute certain kinds of neural stimulation for actual experiential learning. And I suddenly found myself being invited to medical school departments in neurobiology and cognitive science programs, and you know, Robert Liu's here, he's a neurobiologist, but I have to say they are a nasty group of people. They are a nasty group of people. And I looked around at all these white coats and all these serious, aggressive faces, and I said, I don't want to be here. I know this is where it ought to go, but I'm not interested. So I was looking around for a different path. I had come up with some things on mate choice, search theory. That was an aside. I said, well, let me look at some of this stuff. And there was a dominant model for how animals choose mates, you know, and it was articulated by Andy Janitos, and John Maynard Smith was a great champion of this particular strategy, which was called the best of N, which is potential mates would be sampled. You would go around and sample, and let's just say that, you know, the females are the choosy ones, so they go around and sample N males, and then they come back to the male that they like the best and mate with them. And John Maynard Smith always argued that the best of N was the best strategy you could possibly have. Well, because I had had this economics background and interest, I said, well, you know, that's a lot like searching for a job. You know, searching for a mate is like searching for a job. I said, I wonder how economics deals with this problem of finding a job. And it turns out that there's this huge literature in labor markets, and it's called job search theory. And so I read up on job search theory, and there was the best of N strategy had been articulated in job search theory. And it had been attacked by economists, and they said, well, you know, that's the best of N is always going to be the best strategy, but people are neglecting the costs of going around. It's costly to go around and prepare for a job interview and drive to jobs. And it's costly to go around trying to find mates and sample mates. So what if you add costs to search? What happens then? And it turns out that there's another kind of complicated probability theory. It uses martingale theory. Steve will know what that is. It uses martingales to look at these kinds of strings of offers. And if you have a critical threshold, it balances the expectations of search against the costs of search. And you can come up with a critical threshold that says that if you encounter a mate or if you get a job offer that's above some critical threshold, then you'll accept it. You won't go around sampling N. You'll just have you'll carry around a critical threshold instead of this. And then it'll be based on what the costs are associated with searching. And I wrote a paper that showed that the sequential search would outcompete the best of N. It's turned out that I did that as an aside pretty quickly. You know, it was right before my wife was pregnant, right before I had a son. I locked myself up in the library and wrote a bunch of papers, and this was one of them. This has been my most cited paper, you know, and I kind of dashed it off. And a lot of people, and there were some great experiments done on this by Teresa Capone-Cook, who's here to look at this. And there's been kind of like a little mini industry trying to figure out, do animals use the best of N, or do they use sequential search? And this is kind of going on completely independent of me. There's been a bunch of papers written on this, but I was lucky. And in terms of stories, career stories, one of my great career moments was I gave this talk at a big international meeting in Uppsala, Sweden, at the International Behavioral Ecology meetings. John Maynard Smith, who was a friend of mine, he was in the back of the audience. And when after I got done, he said, Les, I just still don't see why the best of N doesn't win. And I said, well, John, are you doing anything after the meeting? And he said, yes, I'm going with my wife up to Lapland. We're going to rent a car. And I said, well, what I want you to do, John, is when you drive around up there in Lapland, I want you to look at your gas gauge and tell me whether you go around and sample N gas stations trying to find the cheapest gas, whether you come across a gas station and say, this is cheap enough, I'll fill up here. And he says, and I don't go around sampling N gas stations because of the cost of going around sampling gas stations. And I said, right. And he says, got it. Well, that was a happy moment. Another happy moment was at NC State. I had taught a class. Libby and Bernie, I think, took this class on classic papers and in ecology and evolution. And we invited some distinguished older ecologists to come and give talks about their perspective on ecology and evolution. And we invited Jim Brown, and we invited Nelson Harston Sr. to come and talk. The funny story about Nelson Harston Sr. is after we were having dinner, Libby courageously says, Nelson, what do you think is the most difficult ecological system to work on? And he hesitated for a second and he said, streams. And then he hesitated and he said, cold water streams. And then he said, fish and cold water streams. That was exactly her thesis. It's true. And then we were at Mountain Lake, and one day I got a call from Jim Brown while I was at Mountain Lake. And Jim said, Les, I just got asked by the Ecological Society to do something for the 75th anniversary of the Ecological Society, the ESA. And he said, I think that we should do kind of a classic paper review. But I'll only do it if you'll do it with me. Because he had come there and I had already done this background work. And I said, sure, let's do it together. So we built up a committee to examine and collate these papers. There are some 40-odd papers in there. And it's a book that's it's the only book that's officially been produced by the Ecological Society of America. And the other day, Levi Moran told me, I said, gee, I'm really overwhelmed by the response of people coming, and he said, well, you know, you have produced the most widely read book in ecology. And I hadn't thought about that, but actually it probably is the most widely read and used book in ecology. And I want to say that, you know, Jim and I in the committee, we haven't made a penny off of this. All of the royalties have gone to the Ecological Society as a fund for graduate student travel to meetings and presentations. The book has brought in about $50,000 to the society. It is an enormously well read book, and I'm very happy. I'm very proud of this book. And just to my art side also comes in the cover. The cover is not completely my design, but when the University of Chicago, Susan Abrams sent me the cover photo, the design people had set this leaf vein as parallel to the edge of the page. They had done just like that, you see. And I said, Susan, it really needs to be tilted. They tilted it on the page and they said, oh, it's much better. I said, would you like a job as a designer? Okay. I'm happy about that. I'm happy about the Sustainable Biosphere Initiative. This is really responsible for my transition into disease ecology. The Sustainable Biosphere Initiative, for those of you who don't know, was an exercise that was supported by the Mellon Foundation. The Ecological Society got together a committee to examine what the research priorities were in ecology and to present a research agenda for the whole of the ecological sciences to the National Science Foundation and the National Academy of Sciences. And Frank Press, who was the president of the National Academy of Sciences, wrote to us after this report and said that it was a model for how all professional societies should take responsibility for defining their own research agenda. What was interesting about the Sustainable Biosphere Initiative, and it's grown into, it has its own office in Washington, D.C., and a big agenda. It launched Jane Levchenko's political career. She went on to become the administrator of NOAA and the science advisor for Gore, and things like that. She chaired this committee. She asked me to be on it. And at our very first meeting of this committee, we decided that we would organize research along two axes. What are your intellectual jollies? And what are our national needs? And those aren't necessarily the same things. The thing that gives you your most intellectual jolly may not necessarily help anybody. It may be important downstream, but that's... So what was, and we went around the room trying to figure this out. And what was interesting is that one of the very first things that surfaced was disease ecology. And at the time, disease ecology was this thing in the background. May and Anderson were doing it. It was the thing that was going on in England. And there were people with strong British accents that were running around convincing people that were trying to convince people that this was important. Andy Dobson couldn't get any of his abstracts accepted at the ASA because, well, I don't know whether you've read any of Andy's abstracts. But he always argued that it was because we didn't pay attention to the But so we went around the room and we decided, you know, the ecology of infectious diseases, that's obviously got to be important. But nobody in the room knew anything about it. So I was assigned to go write something about disease ecology. So I spent several months kind of reading Pete Hudson, you know, and Brian Granville, Giannis Antonovics, and Andy Dobson, May, and I said, gee, this is actually interesting. And I wrote the passage, the section of the Sustainable Biosphere Initiative that discusses the role of infectious diseases. And Pat Warner, who was director of the biological sciences. At that time, she said, this is the only part of the sustainable initiative that I'm interested in. Would you organize a workshop? So we talked about that. We organized a workshop. It ended up being organized by at the National Research Council. I'm trying to, Rich Linsky and I organized this meeting. It was coordinated between the Institute of Medicine and the National Academy of Sciences. And we organized this workshop on the ecology and evolution of infectious disease. I think Giannis was there.
Yeah, I brought my plant along.
You brought your plant along?
Along my flowers and the disease.
I know, because Giannis' favorite thing to do, it really pisses off molecular biologists. He says, so we decided to get very modern and clone our genes. And he picks up a lump of grass and he rips it in half and he says, here's a clone. So we wrote this report, and I said, this is interesting, and I want to get more into it. And what's interesting is I couldn't completely break myself away from the behavior part of all this, or the plant part of it. And we started looking at the way in which insects, pollinators, could be vectors of disease. And Bernie Roach did her thesis on that. And then Paul McElhaney, who was a graduate student of mine, we worked with Sunny Power on the way aphids could transmit disease, work moving around things. And then I actually had a grant proposal to look at phlox powdery mildew. Wasn't a very successful project at all because it turns out that it's very difficult to work with phlox powdery mildew. So we did end up with working on a successful project, which was rabies. This is my favorite graph. It summarizes a lot of, and this graph is really the product of Roman Beek, who was a great collaborator of mine, continues to be a great collaborator of mine. He's here. But I want to talk about the origin of what in the world got me interested in rabies, another incidence of luck. So we had, Rick Osfeld and I organized a meeting at NCEAS on disease ecology, trying to figure out what to do with it. And Dobson was doing his usual thing where he was saying, well, we really just need to write a bunch of SDIR models and we'll solve all the problems in the world. And I had said, well, you know, we really need to kind of get space involved in all of this. And he went on some rant about how space is totally irrelevant. I mean, there are two. I wish Andy were here because it still is irrelevant. And so I was pissed off at Andy, and I went off the coffee, and I wrote down 12 ways in which space, explicit treatment of space, was absolutely essential to trying to understand infectious disease dynamics. And this guy that I didn't know, who actually turns out to be right next door to Emory, comes up to me at the break. Jamie Childs, right here, sitting next to my old friend Jamie. And Jamie comes up to me and he says, well, do you know anything about rabies? And I said, no. And then he proceeds to tell me all about this infectious disease that got introduced by translocation of rabid raccoons from Florida, West Virginia, and how CDC has been collecting all this data on rabies. Was the first reportable mandated infectious disease and zoonotic disease. And they had all this data by county, you know, and monthly since 1970s. And he said, do you think that would be interesting? And I went, yeah. and this set up just an enormously important collaboration that I've been working on for 20 years. You know? And it was just pure dumb luck that we were at this NCEAS meeting together, and that I had gone on this rant. Dobson stimulated me to give a rant. So luck is so important, luck. And I've been lucky. Getting Roman as a postdoc was lucky. Getting the graduate students that I've had has been lucky. And I do want to say that I've had many, many great collaborators. Suzanne Lenhart, a long list of Lance Waller, having a spatial statistician next door at Emory, and being interested in spatial dynamics. I mean, this is like unbelievable luck. I've been just really, really lucky. And I've been programmatically, I've been lucky. I mean, there are many people here that I've not collaborated with scientifically, but have been instrumental in helping me and in being involved in the whole development of the program of disease ecology. Brian Grenfell and Pete Hudson and Sonia Oltizer and Giulio DeLeo, although we've written papers together, you know. I've been just enormously lucky. And I do want to say that I've also been lucky in getting married to a wonderful woman, Dee Dee Palazzola, who you all know. And she was, and those of you who know her probably know that she was a professional musician from a very early age. And then she married me. And I've had a great luck at having this son, Daniel Real. You know, here he is graduating from Emory, and you've already seen that he helped me build this deck canoe. So I've been really lucky. And you may ask yourself, you know, how come you were so lucky? I mean, let's face it. And the answer is very obvious, you know, brains and personality.